Volume 1 of I'm in Love with the Villainess was an incredibly flawed start to the series that left me more interested in the potential of the novels moving forward rather than the initial book itself. Volume 2, on the other hand, is that potential starting to come to fruition. In almost every way, it is a step up from the prior volume and even elevates that entry with a few twists and turns that make you want to go back and see it in a different light. From the characters to the story and most importantly, the romance, I'm in Love with the Villainess Volume 2 is a step up over its predecessor. Let's start with the characters, as the two leads got some much needed development that finally allowed me to start getting properly invested in them. Ray, the main character, was a fine enough entity for the first book's plot, but didn't leave much of an impression on her own outside of her infatuation with Claire. She knew the game in and out and thus never really faced an obstacle that she wasn't, at the very least, prepared for. Here, however, characters and events go off script and Ray is forced to react on her own and deal with the issues in front of her without prior knowledge of the game's inner workings there to save her. She also learns that there was much she didn't know about the game, and that comes back to haunt her at various points in the story. There are also antagonists that feel like real obstacles for Ray to overcome and who challenge her in various ways. Whether it's forcing her to confront her feelings for Claire and whether she's truly fine letting someone else have her, or giving her a difficult opponent she can't just bulldoze over. After how on top of things Ray was in the last book, it really is refreshing to see her face opponents that make her go,
"Okay, I know it's filthy rich coming from me, but your powers are bullshit!"
Overall, Ray got some much needed character work and it made her a much more appealing protagonist. Ray wasn't the only character to get some much needed character work, however, as we finally get to see the payoff of Claire's character arc in this volume. Where before I was having to tolerate Claire's actions and tendency because of the promise that she would eventually become a better person, here we see that promise fulfilled. Claire gets a great arc in this volume as she goes from an aristocratic snob who looks down on the peasants to a person who has been made all too aware of the differences in life experiences between a commoner and a noble and seeks to change that. It was a joy to see Claire gradually realize just how unequal and unfair her society really was, and see her come to terms with that. Her arc from villainess to humanitarian was really well done, and was a good 1-2 punch with Ray's arc. Ray and Claire weren't the only ones who got to shine, however. You gets a really well done arc that highlights some important topics. Even if the royal heir story isn't as one-to-one a comparison as the author tries to make it. It's still good, however. There's also a new character named Lily, who joins Ray and Claire's odd couple routine and helps to add some refreshing interactions that aren't just the same Ray and Claire squawkfest that I've read for the last several hundred pages. Ray also gets a new rival character that acts as a great initial antagonist for her. Other characters like the King, Rod, Misha, and Thane also have some nice moments, Misha especially. The romance between Claire and Ray also got some much needed work as we finally move on from the squawking they've done to one another for a book plus and finally move on to actual character development with regards to their feelings. Ray is forced to acknowledge that she isn't happy with the idea that someone else could be with. She is also confronted with the fact that she might not know Claire quite as well as she thought she did and has to deal with that fact. Claire is also forced to confront her own feelings regarding Ray. She goes from the way she was treating Ray for most of the last book to actually being genuinely concerned for Ray and growing to actually trust and rely on her. There is an actual fondness, and their dynamic goes from this incredibly tired and kinda creepy dynamic that had dominated the prior book to one of mutual affection that resembles more of an old married couple. Ray is still a little creepy from time to time, but it really dies down after the second story arc of the volume. Seeing their relationship bloom into this was a joy to read and was another aspect that was markedly improved over the prior volume, superbly building off the foundation that book had set. Now let's use all of that praise as a cushion as I get into the weakest aspect of the volume, the story, though even that is a step up in some ways over the prior light novel volume. You can divide this book into about 5 different story arcs and they all vary in quality. The first arc was a good time as it started the volume off on the right foot by immediately getting to work on Ray. She is put through the ringer in this arc as she faces challenges that she can't just overcome by solely relying on her knowledge of the game, because she actually has to overcome her own insecurities. It was refreshing to see Rei on the back foot, and Claire also got some nice development in this arc. The antagonist for the story also worked well and provided a good force to push Rei into motion. It was a nice start to the book. But it was also rather rushed, as the conflict happens within 30 to 50 pages and then is over in the blink of an eye. Things don't really get the chance to breathe, and it takes away some of the oomph of some moments, as you're immediately going on to the next one. It could have used some more pages to flesh out the story. Instead, you get a truncated version that, while I enjoyed it, I feel it could have been so much more. This isn't helped by it being followed by easily, in my opinion anyway, the weakest arc of the whole volume, that I really wish could have been combined with the prior arc somehow. Not to say that the volume's second arc is bad, however, as this is where Claire's arc really takes off in the story, as she visits Rei's hometown and sees what the life of a peasant is truly like. That part of the narrative was good, as was getting to see just how comfortable Claire was starting to get around Rei. If the entire arc had been like that, it would have been great. But instead, the plot gets taken over by an external threat that was not really that interesting, aside from a few cool moments for Rei and Claire. It unnecessarily ate up pages that could have gone to the prior arc, but instead gets taken up by a plotline that didn't really do anything to add to the story, and a twist that did not have any real time to develop. Luckily, the next arc is arguably the strongest in the volume, and probably in the whole series so far, as it centers around Perseus and the royal family. It gives some interesting depth to a character that I had not really cared about before, and turns it into someone that you can at least be somewhat invested in. It also introduces a character who will be critical for the next two arcs in Lily, who, as I already said, was a welcome addition to Claire and Rei's dynamic. Misha also gets a chance to shine and show that she's more than just Rei's generic childhood friend. There is some neat world building, interesting political machinations, and a finale that was incredibly engaging. I don't really have anything negative to say about this arc, as it got the proper time to shine, entertained me as a reader, and did some good work with the characters. The penultimate arc of the volume was also a decent time. It puts the leads in a new situation that work to advance Claire's character arc, give more depth to Lily, and show that while Rei knows a lot about the world she's in, and can do her best to mitigate some events, she's not some omnipotent being, and those events can still blow up in her face. I do think this arc suffered from some of the same issues that the first arc did, as it ran through its scenes rather quickly, but it suffered a bit less for it, and only felt a little bit rushed. This volume's final arc was more of a mixed bag, however, that had some truly great highs and some disappointing flatliners. Things kick into high gear and the events Rei had been planning for the entire last two volumes finally occur. It's engaging seeing her try to guide Claire into avoiding her fate in the original game, and seeing them really start coming together as a pair was nice. The final payoff to all of that planning might honestly be my favorite scene in the entire series, as it's a real effective moment. The next few scenes are incredibly engaging, but then we hit the finale, and the finale was a little disappointing. Everything is resolved in an incredibly quick fashion, and the issues and conflict that had been built up are handled with little issue, some even being shown to have been solvable well before this. We barrel towards a happy ending, and it honestly all feels a little lacking. Like, I know this is the moment where good is supposed to triumph, but it just happens way too quickly. But that's not too surprising, as the author seemed to believe that she might not be able to get to write any more of the story and wanted to wrap everything up. So it's unfortunate, but I also understand. It also unfortunately affects the epilogue, as the author adds an element that could have been developed over an entire book, but tags it on at the very end because they aren't sure if they'll be able to write that other book. The epilogue is also really weirdly structured and could have been trimmed down. Not to say I don't like what's in the epilogue, as that's not the case at all. It's incredibly precious and adorable. I just really wish it could have gotten the time it deserved. But I understand if the author wasn't sure if they would get to write more, so they did this instead. Again, understandable, but unfortunate. But don't let that last paragraph confuse you, however. I still really like this volume. It was a major improvement over the last one in several ways, and has me officially invested in this series going forward. The characters have become more engaging, and the romance has finally got to the point where I can actually enjoy it. Heck, even the story, despite my complaints, improved over the last installment. It was more interesting and gave me several more memorable moments than its predecessor. I am now on board with wherever this story goes next, as it has finally concluded the initial plot line that it set out to do, and can go in any direction it wants to, and I find that exciting, and I can't wait to see what the next volume brings.